before there were temples, before there were cities, kings, or carved names on stone. There was water, endless water, and mud. That thick, bitter mud that clung to ankles and dried into cracks across the palms of men who dared plant seeds in it. You are standing now in the southern stretch of what would one day be called Sumer. In a time when the Tigris and Euphrates were not boundaries, but wild arteries, unpredictable and feared. There were no maps then, only memory and mud trails. The sky was not watched by priests, but read by hungry farmers looking for breaks in the clouds. This story begins with one man, whose name was never written, but whose actions carried forward for thousands of years. He was not a warrior. He was not a ruler. He held no title, carved no monument. But he understood something most did not. The rivers could be persuaded. At this time, around 6000 BCE, agriculture was still tentative in the Fertile Crescent. Small clusters of humans lived along elevated ridges, careful not to build too close to the floodplain, for the river was a hungry god. Each season, it would swell with snowmelt from the north, bringing with it both life and destruction. The banks were never the same year to year. You could not trust them. But for this man, let us call him Cal, the destruction was not a threat. It was an opportunity. Cal observed the patterns, not just of the water, but of the wind, the birds, the timing of root bursts in the reeds. He watched the river rise, not in fear, but in calculation. Where others saw chaos, Cal saw rhythm. He began to mark the flood's reach with sticks and stones. He paced its rise with the moon. His neighbors called it foolish. One said, "You are measuring the sky with pebbles." But Cal was patient. At night, under the stars, he scratched lines in the dirt. A groove here for runoff, a mound there to divert the water's flow. Over years, perhaps decades, he built a channel. It did not stop the flood, but it bent it, just slightly, enough to let the water linger in certain places, enough to allow dry patches to remain safe during the worst of it. The first canal was no wider than a man's shoulders, yet it changed everything. Cal's barley survived a season when others lost theirs. It was not just luck, the elders whispered. He had spoken to the rivers in a language they understood. This moment, this single act of guiding water, was the quiet birth of Mesopotamian engineering. No proclamation marked it, no festival commemorated it. But it was the first whisper of what would become levees, canals, irrigation ditches and reservoirs that allowed cities like Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur to rise from the plains like stacked stones toward the sun. Cal did not seek followers, but people came. At first, to ask questions, then to copy his lines in the dirt. Eventually, entire families rebuilt their planting patterns around his channels. But still, no one wrote his name. What they did write, however, were the first accounts of water rights arguments. A generation after Cal, clay tablets tell us of men disputing how much water they were owed. Fields dried because a neighbor closed his gate upstream. Accusations flew. Fines were issued. And from this, perhaps for the first time in history, law was born not from bloodshed, but from agriculture. From the shared need to understand and regulate something as basic as wet earth. Cal's descendants were not kings, but they were problem solvers. They reinforced dikes with woven reeds. They lined canals with compacted clay. When the water rose too high, they carved overflow trenches. When it dipped too low, they dug deeper. Every act a conversation with the land. By 3000 BCE, those first lines in the dirt had evolved into vast networks of irrigation, stretching from city to city, feeding thousands. This was not just agriculture, it was control. control over time, growth, famine, and power. Yet there was a cost. As cities became more dependent on their engineered water systems, they also became more vulnerable. A poorly maintained canal in one region could mean starvation in another. Floodplains were now owned by temple estates and elite families who used the river as leverage. The very thing that had empowered the first farmers was now a tool for political dominance. But none of that was Cal's doing. He had only wanted to grow barley where barley refused to grow. He had only wanted to make the river pause, just long enough for the soil to catch its breath. There's something sobering about knowing that the first engineers of history didn't wear robes, didn't speak laws, didn't write on tablets. They walked barefoot in the mud. They lost crops. They rebuilt them, and they learned from silence. The next time you pass over a dam or see the smooth curve of a canal on a satellite image, remember that it began here, between two rivers, under a sun that never blinked. But how did Cal's methods survive long enough to shape empires? Who carried those techniques into the age of cities? And what happened when the rivers finally stopped listening? Long after Cal's bare feet had hardened into the memory of the land, the grooves he carved into the soil still remained. Time had pressed them deeper, not through erosion, but through repetition. Sons had retraced their father's footsteps with heavier tools and more organized purpose. What had once been a quiet experiment had become the bones of a system, an unspoken agreement between earth and man. The river would yield, but only to those who understood how to ask without force. Several lifetimes after Cal, a cluster of reed huts stood near the bend of one of his widened trenches. It was no longer just farmland. It was becoming something more. Potters had set up their kilns near the bank, their hands stained with the same clay that once choked the fields. Women wove baskets for grain that would now be stored rather than eaten immediately. Children played in the shade of small mud structures, while elderly men sharpened wooden ploughs with stones smoothed by the very waters Cal had tamed. The settlement had no name yet, but its rhythm was steady. One of the men who rose from this village was Enshil, a quiet labourer who'd watched his father rebuild the same collapsed canal wall 3 times in one season. Enshil wasn't known for speeches, but he was known for his precision. When others would drag clay into a canal wall with their hands, he would place each lump in a line, angled against the current, with small openings that allowed water to breathe without overwhelming the structure. He listened to how water moved, not just where it went, but how it hummed when pressed, how it pulled at loose threads in the mud like fingers plucking strings. Over time, Enshil's section of the canal became the most stable. His neighbours began building their homes closer to his flow. Bakers set up small ovens nearby, using the proximity to rinse their flour bowls in the stream. Even scribes, wandering traders who could read lines on clay, took notice. One of them, a man from the north named Idash, decided to write what he saw. He called the place Etur Namu, meaning where water sleeps in obedience. The name wasn't official. It wasn't carved into any monument, but it was whispered enough times to matter. What made Etur Namu different from earlier settlements wasn't just its canals, it was its storage. Enshil had built not just flow, but stillness, pools where water could rest, reservoirs carved deep into the ground and lined with bitumen from faraway marshes. These reservoirs allowed the village to grow crops even during dry spells, and with that came trade. Barley for copper, fish for obsidian, baskets for wool. The village became a point on someone else's route, and when roads are drawn, permanence follows. Soon, Enshil's fields were no longer his. A priest from the temple city of Eridu arrived one spring, carrying a carved staff and an entourage of quiet record keepers. They spoke not of gods, but of ownership. The priest observed the canal system for 3 days, then announced that Etur Namu was now under the protection of the temple, In return for safety and recognition, the village would offer a portion of its harvest to the goddess Nin-Hursag. Enshil did not object. He simply nodded. He had never sought to own what he built, only to preserve it. But change, once invited, rarely leaves. The temple's involvement brought more than protection. It brought structure. Tablets were introduced, and with them, the burden of measurement. Water was no longer just a force of nature. It was a resource with value. Every canal was charted. Every field assigned a number. Scribes began calculating yield ratios, counting seed against flood duration, mapping rainfall against moon cycles. The art of listening to water became the science of commanding it. And with this shift, something subtle was lost. Enshil noticed that fewer young farmers sat by the banks watching the current. Instead, they stared at charts and waited for instructions. Maintenance schedules replaced intuition. Rituals replaced improvisation. The river had been tamed, but at the cost of curiosity. Still, the city grew, from mud to brick, from huts to two-story homes. The canals fed not only crops, but life. A market formed where fishmongers shouted across reed stalls, and potters sold painted bowls with spiral motifs. There was now a shrine at the center of the town, where priests offered grain to ensure the rivers would not overflow. No one remembered Cal, and few still mentioned Enshil, but their patterns endured in the bricks and bends. One year, the floodwaters came early. The southern walls of the canal cracked, and the water spilled into the sleeping quarter of the city. Several homes were lost. Panic rose. Accusations followed. The scribes pointed to a missed entry in the maintenance tablet. A young boy, barely 15, admitted he'd forgotten to close the lower gate. His name was written on a tablet, then forgotten again. But Enshil remembered. He waded into the breach barefoot, as Cal might have. He moved the clay with his hands. He rebuilt the wall without measurement or ritual, just shape and feel. The next morning, the canal had quieted again. Yet this act too passed without ceremony. That year, the city changed its name officially. The tablet found in the temple vaults would read, Uruk's beginning. The scribes would say it was because a descendant of kings had chosen the site. But the water, and the canal that first bent it, had chosen the place long before. It's easy to forget the lives behind systems. Behind every wall of Uruk's mighty structure was a hand like Enshil's, shaping clay. Behind every metric was a failed crop, a flooded home, a barefoot repair in the dark. Civilization in Mesopotamia did not rise from victory. It rose from adaptation, from the willingness to shape and reshape. But if water could be controlled, what happened when men decided to control each other in the same way? Who would dig the next channel, and who would be forced to walk it? By the time the city walls of Uruk stood solid and proud beneath the Mesopotamian sun, the river that once defied the first farmer's hands now glided in obedient channels. The water no longer scattered wildly across the floodplain. It marched where it was told. But the flow of authority had shifted as well. No longer did water serve the needs of the field alone. It now served the decree of the temple and the calculation of the scribe. Enshil had grown old in silence. He watched from a shaded corner near the eastern basin as younger men, trained not by earth, but by wax tablets and rigid formulas, now dictated when gates should open and when walls should be mended. The wisdom once passed from hand to hand through muscle and mud had been replaced by symbols pressed into clay. That language of water, once spoken in feeling and form, had been replaced by arithmetic. The priests of Uruk, draped in linen dyed with indigo, brought from the far lands, no longer knelt near the banks. They spoke of water as they would livestock or grain, as something measured, taxed, and owned. Canals were no longer paths between harvests. They were lines of power, their measurements used in court disputes, their yields tracked to calculate tithes. It was said the goddess Inanna watched over them, but it was the city officials who counted the drops. Yet even in this orderly design, the old river's temperament never vanished completely. One autumn, following an unexpected tremor that loosened the northern embankments, the central reservoir overflowed. Several storehouses were ruined, along with precious tablets that recorded trade between Uruk and distant Elam. Panic surged through the city's heart, not from the flood itself, but from the loss of record. Without clay to prove agreement, trust had no weight. In response, the temple enacted a new law. All future canal repairs must be recorded and supervised by certified scribes. A seal would be impressed upon every clay docket. And with this decision, something fundamental changed. Water was no longer simply directed, it was documented. Not just the flow of rivers, but the movements of men. Every shovelful of dirt, every length of clay wall, every drop diverted from its natural course would now leave a trace in the archives. This may sound like progress, and perhaps it was. But with each decree, the individual disappeared. No one remembered who dug the ditch. Only the date and the approval mark remained. Men like Enshil faded into the margins of memory, replaced by titles, offices, and rows of storage shelves. A young boy named Lugal emerged from this new world of order. Unlike Enshil, Lugal never walked the length of a canal barefoot. He had soft hands, trained from childhood to grip the stylus and press lines into clay. His father, a ranking temple official, ensured his son was educated not in the field, but in the quiet rooms of measurement and law. Lugal learned to calculate flood levels based on lunar cycles. He studied ancient grain yields and applied them to the predictions of next season's tax demands. But he never smelled the wet soil. He never stood knee-deep in rising water. At 25, Lugal authored a new system of canal management. His approach divided the region into squares, each assigned a number and a manager. Instead of each farmer handling their own segment, the city appointed teams to rotate through assignments, much like soldiers in formation. Productivity increased, so did record keeping, and with both came control. It was during Lugal's reforms that the first true water census occurred. Clay tablets from this period list canal lengths down to the half finger, gate dimensions to the smallest digit, and storage capacities for every reservoir across Uruk's outer reaches. Water had become not just a tool, but a kingdom of numbers. And yet, beneath it all, the original canal, Cal's Forgotten Bend, still carried water. Though now modified and twice widened, its flow still moved with the old rhythm. No inscription mentioned its beginnings. No ceremony honored its maker. But every drop that reached the fields bore the echo of that first silent negotiation between man and river. As Lugal's authority grew, so too did his ambition. He proposed the expansion of Uruk's irrigation grid into the unclaimed northern reaches, where the land was drier, harder, and less forgiving. Advisors warned him that the terrain was unsuitable, that the clay there cracked too easily, and that the river's strength did not stretch so far. But Lugal's confidence rested not in experience, but in formula. He commissioned the dig anyway. A workforce of nearly 400 men was assembled, some laborers, some enslaved, others merely indebted. They dug in straight lines, as the plans dictated. They carved through hills, forced canals where none were meant to be, and lined the channels with thin coatings of imported resin. It looked perfect on the tablets. But the land did not respond. The water refused to flow. It stagnated, filled with silt, overflowed where it wasn't supposed to. The dryness of the northern soil absorbed what it could and cracked beneath what it couldn't hold. Crops failed. Villagers abandoned the fields. The northern project, though beautiful in theory, had ignored the one lesson Cal and Enshil had lived by. Water could not be bullied. It had to be understood. Lugal was humiliated. Though his status prevented open criticism, whispers spread. A scribe recorded the failure, not as a misjudgment, but as an uncooperative region. The canal was abandoned after 6 years. It dried into a shallow scar in the earth, visited only by wind and weeds. In his later years, Lugal commissioned a memorial tablet, not for himself, but for the water. It read simply, "All that is measured may still escape the hand." It was the closest a scribe king ever came to admitting error. And thus, the first story of Mesopotamian water ends, not in triumph, but in transformation. The river had been tamed, yes, but in the process, men began to tame each other. The knowledge passed from farmer to canal builder had become law, and then law became record, and finally, record became rule. The flow of the river mirrored the flow of control. Cal, the barefoot farmer, had once watched a bend in the water and carved a channel with his hands. Enshil, the quiet builder, had shaped that channel into a reservoir, and Lugal, the boy of numbers, had turned that reservoir into a nation's ledger. But what happened to the stories not written in clay? The ones carried only by the fields and forgotten by the scribes? And if water could remember, what would it say about the next city rising in the east, where bricks were being laid, without even a glance at the river? Long before the air turned black with temple incense and the scent of baked brick drifted across rooftops, there was only wind. It moved without instruction over open plains, rustling the reeds that had not yet learned to bend beneath walls. But after the rivers had been tamed and the hands of men began to shape not just fields, but futures, something new emerged on the horizon, something higher than a hut and heavier than a canal. A city, not one born by accident, like the clustered villages along Enshil's reservoir, but one forged by plan, by power, and by permanence. The failure of Lugal's northern canal lingered like an unswept echo, but it did not halt ambition. In fact, it hardened it. The failure was not blamed on man's misjudgment, but on the land's refusal. And so, instead of expanding outward, the next generation looked inward, to build density instead of distance. If the rivers could be bound and the fields could be measured, then surely the people could be enclosed. Thus began the first stages of what would one day be called Eridu, not the mythical Eridu of later myths, but the earlier settlement that bore its name like a whisper through dust. Its founding wasn't heralded by trumpets or celestial signs. It began with clay, piled high, stamped firm, dried slowly under sun and smoke. Not for grain or irrigation, but for walls. The idea came from a man named Atuk, a former overseer in Lugal's abandoned northern venture. Where his former master had trusted the perfection of calculations, Atuk trusted only what he could stack and see. He had returned south, quietly, bringing with him a hardened bitterness and an obsession to build a city that could not collapse, not from water, not from silence. Atuk selected a patch of raised land, barely above the seasonal flood line, where old reeds had been cleared to make space for kiln pits. This was clay country, not farmland. The soil was too coarse to grow anything meaningful, but perfect for bricks. He hired a small team, not soldiers, not scribes, but tired men with burnt hands and backs bent from canal work. Together, they began shaping the earth into cubes. Not beautiful, but strong. Not uniform, but loyal to their purpose. These first bricks were dried beside fire, not in ovens. The air became filled with smoke, and the wind, which once moved freely, now curled around half-formed walls and shrines. What Atuk built was not a temple. Not yet. It was a structure with thick outer walls and a flat surface atop it. part dwelling, part lookout, part dream. A place to watch the horizon and claim it, silently. Soon, others came, not for faith, but for function. Fishermen who had lost their boats in seasonal floods, potters who needed steady flame, broken farmers who needed steadier land than the fields could offer. Eridu welcomed them, not with banners, but with shelter. Its outer walls became thicker, its inner passages narrower, rooms multiplied, like insects, haphazard, yet somehow purposeful. Atuk did not seek authority, but authority sought him. The more the bricks rose, the more questions came. How wide should the alley be between homes? Who would clean the waste pits? Where would the smoke from the kilns go? These weren't spiritual questions. They were survival. Yet in answering them, Atuk became something he never aimed to be. A planner. Perhaps even a ruler. Still, the city had no shrine, no god, no symbol. It stood in contrast to Uruk's temple-dominated skyline, and some travelers called it cursed for that reason. A city without a deity, they whispered, is a wall waiting to fall. But Atuk responded with silence and mortar. He believed in the god of endurance. That belief was tested one year when the wind shifted harshly during the dry season. Fires from the open kilns grew erratic. Smoke filled the city, making breathing difficult. Some accused Atuk of inviting destruction by refusing the gods. They pleaded with him to offer grain at least, or a cup of beer to one of the river spirits. He refused. When the smoke grew unbearable, many fled. Only a few remained behind the walls, wrapped in wet cloth, praying not to a god, but to survive the night. But Eridu didn't burn. The walls held. The bricks, baked half by flame, half by sun, had absorbed enough heat to harden against even uncontrolled fire. When the winds died down, the city remained, blackened, yes, but intact. The exiles returned slowly, sheepish. Atuk never spoke a word of blame. Instead, he built the first chimney. Not a true chimney, as we know it now, but a narrow tunnel carved vertically through one of the structures. Smoke climbed it like a trained animal. The next kiln was built beside it, then another. The sky over Eridu cleared. It was not a miracle, it was design. And that, perhaps more than walls or water, was Mesopotamia's greatest achievement. Not divine intervention, but deliberate adjustment. 1,000 small choices, repeated until they held. In time, Eridu was noticed by scribes from Uruk. They arrived with their tablets, expecting to find a temple, or at least a ziggurat. They found neither. What they found instead was a city of uniformity, rows of homes, alleys shaped to direct breeze, waste trenches angled away from the wells. It was not beautiful, but it was orderly. They wrote of it with confusion. No god rules here, and yet the people obey. Eventually, a priest from Nipper was dispatched to investigate. He brought with him a small idol, carved from imported lapis lazuli. He offered it to Atuk as a gift, an image of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. A city without a god will not survive, the priest warned. Atuk, now wrinkled and half-stooped, accepted the gift without a word. He placed the idol in a small alcove near the entrance of the kiln house. He did not build a temple, but he didn't refuse the symbol either. From then on, Eridu was listed in temple records as the city of Enki. And so the god arrived, not by miracle, but by negotiation. The smoke still rose. The bricks still stacked. The people still shaped their world from fire and function. But how long could a city survive when belief arrived last? And what happens when the next generation forgets why the walls were built in the first place? By the time Eridu's walls had faded from novelty into background, when smoke from the kilns no longer drew curiosity but comfort, the people within had begun to forget that the city had ever stood without gods. The lapis idol of Enki, once quietly placed at the edge of Atuk's kiln house, had become an anchor for stories that had little to do with bricks and everything to do with myth. The children of Eridu, who had never seen the river unchained or the land without walls, grew up believing the city had always belonged to the god of freshwater. They told one another that it was Enki who taught the first builders to mold the earth, that he whispered blueprints into the smoke. Atuk, who lived long enough to hear the tales forming around him, never corrected them. His back had bent beyond repair, his hands swollen from decades of clay and fire. He spent his last years seated beside the first chimney, watching the light shift between the stacks. When he died, there was no public mourning, but someone, no one remembers who, carved a small pattern into the side of his brick bench. It was a spiral, the same shape now painted on bowls sold by potters near the southern gate. The same spiral that scribes would later claim as Enki's mark. With Atuk gone, the city needed a new center, not structurally. The walls remained, and the kilns still burned. But symbolically, who would speak when decisions had to be made? Who would weigh disputes when the measurements on tablets contradicted each other? Eridu had always thrived on its lack of hierarchy, but absence too has a cost. A man named Ninmaru, the son of a scribe who had arrived during the early brick era, rose gradually to fill the space left behind. Unlike Atuk, Ninmaru had never built a wall, but he had memorized every canal depth recorded in Uruk, every grain standard etched in Nippur. He had a gift not for shaping matter, but for shaping perception. He understood how the appearance of control could stabilize a place even when truth wavered. His first act was subtle. He expanded the alcove housing the Enki idol, just slightly, enough to place a single oil lamp beside it and a narrow mat for kneeling. Then, on the first day of planting season, he invited a group of elders to sit and offer a single bowl of barley at the shrine. It was not framed as worship. It was framed as respect, a custom, a small acknowledgement of cycles. But what begins as custom often settles into law. Within 5 years, Eridu's shrine had become its heartbeat. Not a temple in the grand sense, no towering ziggurat, no singing priests, but a space of rhythm. The oil was always lit, the mat always clean, and Ninmaru always present. He did not call himself a priest. Others did that for him. He introduced a ledger system next. Inspired by the temple scribes of Ur, he began recording grain contributions, firewood donations, and labor hours. Not for taxation, he insisted, but for balance. So the kiln workers did not exhaust themselves. So the water carriers were not left without help. The idea was sound, and so it spread. But order has a way of demanding symbols. What Atuk had resisted, a central figure of power, was now creeping into the cracks left behind. And people, it seemed, liked having someone to point toward when uncertainty grew thick. The spiral Atuk had never explained now appeared on seals, etched into the handles of storage jars, pressed into the soft bricks above doorways. The mark of Enki, Ninmaru said. But those who remembered whispered that it was the old man's habit, drawn mindlessly into wet clay when he was lost in thought. Regardless, the spiral had found its place. The children of Eridu grew in confidence. They no longer feared outsiders. They welcomed them. Merchants from distant Sippa began visiting the southern market. A metalworker from Mari brought with him tools made of strange greenish copper. Fishermen from the east taught new netting techniques, and weavers introduced cloth patterns inspired by mountain trails. Eridu, for all its quiet birth, was becoming a city with influence. But as the city stretched, something fundamental began to fade. The streets were narrower now. The open spaces where elders once shared reed mats had been filled in with the new dwellings. Fires burned hotter, but also dirtier. The air no longer carried the same scent of drying clay and fresh water. It carried the sharp tang of sweat, waste, and industry. To manage the density, Ninmaru introduced a curfew bell, a simple sound rung from a hanging metal plate near the shrine. When it rang, fires were to be lowered, passageways cleared, and noise silenced. It worked. But it also marked the moment Eridu stopped being organic. It became procedural. New disputes began to arise, not about walls or bricks, but about inheritance. Who owned the chimney Atuk had built? Who controlled the shrine? Who had the right to light the oil lamp? Ninmaru attempted to arbitrate, but his presence had become too symbolic. Each decision he made was now interpreted as divine endorsement. And that is how the first priest-king of Eridu was born. Not by war, not by vote, but by drift. Ninmaru never called himself that. He died before the term took hold. But his grandson, Isur-en, inherited the spiral seal. And when he knelt before the idol at the planting festival, no one stood beside him. They all waited for his word. The city had accepted its face. It's easy to forget how quickly customs harden into chains, how shared needs become ritual and rituals become institutions. What began as a shelter for those fleeing flood and fire had become a place where power lived in symbols, and the builders had become spectators to their own history. But what of the old farmers, those whose hands once pressed the earth with reverence instead of rulership? Where had they gone? And as Eridu prepared to mark its first generation of spiral-sealed rulers, what did the rising children believe the city had been built for? To survive, to remember, or simply to rule? By the time the third ruler sealed his decree with the spiral of Enki, the people of Eridu no longer asked where the symbol came from. They didn't know that it had once been an absent-minded scratch on Atuk's bench, nor that it had crept from brick to belief with the quiet rhythm of breath. For them, it had always been the city's mark, etched by the god of water, preserved by the priest-kings, and echoed in the swirl of incense that now filled the shrine each morning. The memory of the first builders had softened, smudged by time, and shaped into story. Isur-en's great-grandson, called Luani, sat upon the wide stone seat that had replaced the old kiln hearth. He wore a robe dyed deep grey from soot and ash, its hem stiff with ceremonial resin. Each day, he emerged into the small courtyard outside the shrine and recited the same 3 verses. One to Enki for wisdom, one to the waters for balance, and one to the walls for stillness. The people bowed, some with faith, others from habit. But Eridu had grown heavier, not in height, but in memory. The narrow streets that once bent like reeds now stood rigid with boundaries. Property lines, tax weights, work quotas. Every corner had a name, every household a duty. The spiral that once meant protection had become a stamp of accountability. If a barrel was found unsealed, it was said the spiral had not been honoured. If a home crumbled, it was whispered that the family had failed in devotion. Ritual had replaced intention. It was during this time that a strange drought gripped the region. The rains that had once whispered through the canals now fell only in stories. The rivers receded. Reservoirs that had once brimmed quietly began to shrink into hardened mirrors of dust. For a city built on clay and fire, the absence of water was not merely discomfort, it was betrayal. Luani, with his polished speech and silver-threaded robes, called for ceremonies. Larger ones, louder ones. He summoned musicians from Ur and priests from Nippur. The shrine of Enki was enlarged, given a second chamber for purification rituals. Offerings doubled. The spiral was now carved in stone, not just pressed in wet clay. It was everywhere. But still, the sky refused to speak. The people began to murmur, not against Enki, but against their own certainty. What if the spiral had never been divine? What if it had never been meant as a promise? Among the murmurs was a man named Telu, a kiln worker whose family had lived in Eridu since the time of Atuk. He claimed that his great-grandfather had once told him the spiral was not holy. It was simply how the old man marked time. Telu said the walls were not sacred, but practical, that the chimney had not been a divine breath, but a clever vent. These claims, at first, were ignored, but as the heat grew unbearable and water grew thin, people began to listen. One evening, Telu gathered a few neighbors near the original chimney, now cracked and half buried behind newer constructions. He told them about Kal, the farmer who first spoke with the river, and Enshil, who rebuilt broken walls without a priest's approval. He spoke not as a rebel, but as a remembering man. Word spread. Lu-Ani was not blind to this. He summoned Telu to the central court, asking if he denied the blessings of Enki. Telu bowed and replied softly, "I deny nothing. But I remember that walls were once built to shelter, not to shine." That night, a guard was posted outside Telu's home. Not to arrest him, Lu-Ani feared open punishment, but to remind others that silence was safer. Yet the damage had been done. The city's youth began asking dangerous questions. Why did the spiral only appear after the shrine? Who decided which homes paid more grain? Why were the canals left uncleaned while the shrine walls were polished daily? Lu-Ani responded by creating a new ritual, a public procession, carrying water from the city's last deep well to the temple basin. It was meant to remind the people that their god still held water, even in drought. But when the urn cracked halfway through the walk, spilling its contents into the dust, silence fell. The priests blamed the carrier. The people blamed the symbol. The next day, someone scratched out one of the spirals near the market square. It was small, done with a dull blade, but it was noticed. Within a week, 4 more appeared, then 10, then more. Not with fury, but with quiet insistence, as if the bricks themselves were whispering that something had been lost. Lu-Ani ordered the walls repainted. He doubled the guards. He declared a week of fasting and atonement. But the river still slept, and the sky remained mute. One night, the wind returned, not as fire, but as memory. It swept through Eridu's narrow lanes and curled through chimneys long unused. It carried dust from the old canal walls and deposited it in corners where tablets once sat. A woman who had once studied in Ur watched the wind shift her courtyard soil into the shape of a crooked spiral. She didn't clean it. By morning, a quiet agreement had settled over parts of the city. The spiral would no longer be erased, nor would it be worshipped. It would be remembered, on bricks, on jars, on doorframes, not as a mark of power, but as a story of how things once were. Lu-Ani faded in his later years, not from illness, but from irrelevance. The shrine remained, but smaller. The rituals continued, but softer. The people had stopped bowing. They now listened to the wind. The drought eventually broke. The rains did not return with fanfare. They came quietly, tapping the rooftops of Eridu one evening like fingers returning to familiar skin. The reservoir filled slowly. The wells breathed again. And the city, long choked by its own stillness, began to soften. No one claimed credit. No procession was held. Instead, a group of potters cleaned the old chimney and lit a fire, not for offering, but for clay. Eridu survived, not as a temple city, not as a capital, but as a memory in motion. Some years later, a traveller from a distant settlement to the north arrived. He spoke of a strange land where the sun rose late and the rivers carved stone cliffs instead of feeding plains. He carried with him a brick, square, pale, and pressed with a mark he didn't understand. A spiral. He said he'd found it buried near a dried canal, far from any known city, and when asked what it meant, he replied, "I don't know, but it feels like it waited a long time to be seen again." What other marks still lie beneath the soil, waiting to be mistaken for miracles? And what happens when the next city rises, not from belief, but from the shadow of stories once buried? When the rains returned to Eridu and the city settled back into its rhythm, no longer ruled by spiral or shrine, but by quiet utility, a new need began to stir. It did not come with drought or flood, nor was it sparked by gods or rebellion. It rose instead from within the walls themselves, from the weight of memory that no mind could hold. The people had grown too many. The markets traded too widely. The laws had layered upon each other like sediment, and words, once passed by mouth, began to slip through the cracks. No longer could a family remember which patch of barley they owed grain to, or which labourer repaired which canal last season. The children of Eridu had begun to forget not only the names of their great-grandfathers, but the promises they had made on their behalf. Stories faded, trades blurred, agreements soured into disputes, and amid this slow unravelling, a question began to echo among the scribes and traders. How do you hold truth when your hands are full? It was not in Eridu, but further north along the river bend near the rising town of Kish that the answer began to take shape. There, in a cluster of homes where reeds grew thick and clay dried smooth under the open sun, a man named Idin Amar worked as a steward for the grain storehouse. His job was simple, to track what came in and what went out. But the job had grown monstrous. Each month, more families arrived. Some brought goats, others brought millet. Some traded fish for salt, others for cloth. Every agreement had a different measure, a different weight, a different day. Idin Amar kept them all in his head until he couldn't. One morning, after a particularly busy festival of planting, he forgot whether the merchant from Lagash had brought 2 crates of figs or 3. It was a small mistake. But when he guessed wrong, an argument erupted. Voices rose. A fist was thrown. And for the first time in his life, Idin Amar feared that a misremembered number might spill blood. That night, under the low hum of crickets and the distant sound of river frogs, he sat beside a slab of drying clay. He looked at it, not as a builder would, but as a keeper. The surface was smooth, blank, indifferent, but it was firm. It held shape. And suddenly, he wondered if it could hold something more. He picked up a sharp reed and pressed it into the surface, not to carve a picture, but to make a mark. A wedge, then another. He arranged them in rows, not for beauty, but for clarity. 1 wedge for each measure, a line for each name. He had no word for what he was doing, no pattern yet, just a need to make remembering visible. In the morning, he brought the clay to the storehouse and placed it beside the grain pots. When the same merchant returned, Idin Amar did not speak. He pointed, and for the first time, a trade did not end in uncertainty. The other stewards noticed. At first, they mocked the strange symbols, but when disputes ceased, they began copying. Soon, a system of impressions began to form. Wedges pressed at angles, lines dividing space, repetitions forming patterns. These were not yet words, but they were more than marks. They were memory hardened into matter. The system spread quickly, not because it was profound, but because it was useful. In Nippur, scribes adopted it to track livestock rotations. In Lagash, potters used it to log shipments of glaze powder. Even in Eridu, the few scribes still active near the old shrine began marking their tablets, not with prayers, but with measurements. The clay no longer just built walls, it held agreements. It remembered. As the technique matured, symbols grew more precise. A wedge pointing left meant barley. 3 horizontal lines marked a full season. A circle indicated a debt repaid. Soon, names began to appear, simplified at first, but then growing more ornate, more personal. The clay spoke now, in a language only the trained could read. And so, a new profession was born, the scribe. Unlike the builders who shaped the land or the priests who shaped belief, the scribes shaped time. They froze moments, preserved promises, silenced arguments with evidence, and in doing so, they became more powerful than anyone expected. But with power came danger. For if clay could hold truth, it could also hold lies. In Kish, a young scribe named Benunu altered a record, just slightly. He moved one wedge, shifted one line. Suddenly a debt of 6 measures read as 4. A rival trader lost face. A deal fell through, and Benunu was paid in silence. No one saw him do it, but word spread fast. Trust in the tablets wavered. In response, a council of scribes formed. They introduced a seal system. Each tablet, once completed, would be rolled with a carved cylinder, unique to each scribe or official. The spiral of Eridu had faded, but here, in the northern cities, the cylinder became its cousin. Not a symbol of faith, but of authorship. Each seal told a story, a lion beside a tree, a mountain over a fish, a hand reaching toward a crescent. They were art and authority in equal measure, but even seals could be stolen. And so, laws began to emerge, not in speeches but in tablets, clay-born rules, offenses carved in advance, punishments etched with care. The more they wrote, the more they ruled. And the more they ruled, the less room remained for doubt. The scribe's chamber became a sacred place, not of worship, but of verification. A man's worth could now be proven or erased with a single tablet. But who decides what gets written? And what happens when the clay no longer reflects memory, but replaces it? In the years that followed the first pressed wedges, the scribe's reed became as sharp as a blade and twice as lasting. Clay, once used to cradle fire or stack walls, now carried the weight of empire. What began as quiet symbols for counting sacks of grain had transformed into sentences, decrees, and history itself. Each line carried intent, and each intent shaped consequence. The written word no longer whispered, it ruled. By the time the city of Nippur reached its height, the scribes no longer waited for permission to write. They documented everything: harvests, rainfall, priestly disputes, boundary lines, temple offerings, marriages, deaths, celestial movements, and the habits of animals. The clay tablets piled up in vaults, pressed in rows, organized by category, season, and city. They called it order. Others began to call it forgetting. Among the vaults of Nippur, inside a cooled room lined with tablets from as far back as Eridu's drought years, a young apprentice named Etu labored each day to copy older records. His task was mechanical, no room for error, no allowance for interpretation. If a line from a 200-year-old debt register was unreadable, he was instructed to leave it blank. Not to guess, not to ask, only to preserve. Etu had joined the scribe house not for glory, but because his father, once a fish merchant, had died in a debt dispute he could not prove. The tablet that should have cleared his name had gone missing. The seal had been there one day, broken the next. No one could explain how, but the record vanished, and with it, everything his family owned. Etu watched his mother return to reed cutting. His sisters were married off early, and so he entered the scribe house not to serve memory, but to keep it from vanishing again. But in time, he noticed something that disturbed him. Certain records were copied more than others. Temple donations, priestly victories, and trade successes were duplicated again and again, while records of failed harvests, revolts, or wrong judgments were quietly ignored. The old scribes said these omissions were for clarity. The past must guide us, not burden us, one murmured. But Etu felt the burden precisely in what wasn't there. The clay was no longer neutral. It had begun to choose. Across the southern cities, Kish, Umma, this pattern grew. The scribes did not lie outright. They simply copied what was useful. Entire generations of struggle were thinned into single lines. A bad season, a disrupted trade, a temporary absence. The real stories, the hunger, the betrayals, the crushed fields and cracked walls, were left unwritten. And what is history, if not what survives the forgetting? Etu, disturbed, began collecting fragments, chips of broken tablets discarded near the archive pits. He studied them in secret, piecing together half-erased names and interrupted entries. He found references to laws that no longer existed, punishments harsher than the current scribes admitted, and gods who had been quietly replaced by others without ceremony. He didn't tell anyone, but the weight of unspoken truths pressed on him more heavily than the wet clay he molded each day. One tablet in particular haunted him. It was not a law or a debt or even a list. It was a letter. The edges were chipped, the reed marks faded, but the meaning was clear. It was a plea from a mother in Eridu to a temple official in Nippur, begging for mercy after her son had stolen barley during the drought. She had offered her family's only goat in return. She signed it not with her name, but with a symbol, a small spiral. The old spiral. No response to the letter could be found, no record of the woman's fate, but the presence of her voice, pressed into clay and left to dry, stirred something in Etu that the temple chants never had. He began secretly marking certain copies with his own sign, a curved wedge hidden in the bottom corner, just enough to signal it was truthfully transcribed, with no alterations. He taught 2 younger scribes to do the same, quietly, humbly, a gesture of integrity in a system that now valued only repetition. But truth has weight, and even hidden marks leave trails. One morning, a high official from visited the archive and discovered discrepancies between 2 versions of a record. A property transfer involving priestly land. One copy showed 5 parcels. Another, Etu's, showed 4. The missing parcel had been included by the elder scribe, perhaps to appease a temple sponsor. Etu's version reflected the original contract. When questioned, Etu spoke plainly. "I wrote what was there." But silence in a record room is sacred. Speaking against it was betrayal. He was dismissed. Quietly, without punishment. No tablets were broken in front of him, no charges filed. Just the door of the archive sealed behind him, and his marks scrubbed from all the clay he had touched. He left Nippur and travelled south, through Lagash, where the scribes wore ceremonial jewelry, through Uruk, where words were now carved into bricks at the city gates. In each city, he found the same. History written not to record, but to command. Finally, he reached a village near the edge of the old floodplain. A forgotten place, its name long lost to temple ledgers. The people there still scratched simple tallies into potsherds. They remembered their past not in clay, but in story, sung at dusk beside oil lamps. Etu stayed, not to teach, but to listen. He began writing again, but not on temple tablets. He used discarded clay from the fields, shaping them into soft squares, letting children watch as he pressed the reed slowly, explaining each mark. Not as decree, but as invitation. His new records were kept in an open basket beside the village's central gathering place. Anyone could touch them. Some were simple, others were poems. A few were just names, people who had no other memory than what they left behind in voice. And so, in a village untouched by spiral or seal, the clay learned to remember differently. What happens when the clay speaks not for kings, but for those no one asked to remember? And what will the next generation believe when both silence and story claim to be true? Years after Etu vanished into the margins of the known cities, whispers of his clay letters began to travel farther than the trade routes themselves. Merchants spoke of a village without scribes, where even children knew how to press the truth into wet earth. A place where words were not dictated from altars or courts, but grown like barley, slow, intentional, and shared. Most dismissed the tale as exaggeration. A village without hierarchy was, to the learned minds of Nippur and Uruk, an impossibility. Still, curiosity grows in the cracks of denial. In the temple schools, however, the name Etu had become something else, an unspoken caution. The story of a scribe who questioned the tablets, a man who let unwritten things survive. He was neither condemned nor praised, just erased, methodically and without sound. But even absence has edges. Some younger apprentices began to wonder, not loudly, not publicly, but in their minds, who else had written without permission? Meanwhile, the cities grew taller and the tablets heavier. In Ur, a monumental archive was constructed, a towering repository with clay shelves stacked 5 high, guarded day and night. Every shipment, every land grant, every prayer, every insult of record was catalogued and sealed. The scribes became gatekeepers of memory. They no longer simply recorded events. They decided which events deserved clay. The reed had become more powerful than the plough. But beneath this mountain of documentation, the city was fraying. Walls were decorated with etched symbols, yet canals clogged with waste. Temples glowed with oil lamps, yet markets suffered grain shortages. The people began to see that the abundance in the records did not match the hunger in their bellies. Their own lives, unacknowledged on any official tablet, began to feel invisible. It was in this gap between appearance and reality that a boy named Lugal Tarsi was born. He grew up just outside Ur's southern gate, where the city's shadow still fell, but its promises no longer reached. His father worked a patch of borrowed farmland and paid taxes with wheat that often sprouted mold before reaching the collection vessels. His mother mended robes for scribes who never spoke to her beyond commands. Lugal Tarsi was clever. Not in a ceremonial way, but in the way reeds know when to bend before a storm. He listened, watched, learned the marks on the scraps of broken tablets his father sometimes used to patch the roof. Each night, while others slept, he practiced carving the same lines into damp soil, smoothing it again before dawn. He didn't know what the marks meant, only that they meant something. At 12, he wandered into the city, unnoticed, and stood outside the House of Writing. He stared at the grand stone relief that crowned the entrance, Enlil gifting the reed stylus to the first scribe. The symbolism was clear. Writing was divine inheritance. But as he studied the scene, Lugal Tarsi noticed something odd. The river beneath Enlil was drawn straight, unnaturally so. The water had no bend. He had grown up beside that river. He knew its shape, its hesitation, its refusal to obey lines. That night, he returned home and scratched a new symbol into the dirt behind his family's hut. It was not from the tablets. It was his own. A river line that bent once, sharply, before settling. The next day, he scratched the same line into the clay near the well. Others saw it. A child copied it on her water jug. A man carved it into the base of a fishing spear. Within a season, the symbol had spread. It didn't carry an official meaning, but those who used it understood. It meant, simply, not from them. When scribes from Ur discovered the marks, they were unsettled. This was not cuneiform. It did not follow any standardized format. Yet it moved through the population faster than any decree. They attempted to ban its use. Temple runners removed jugs. Market stalls were fined. The symbol was scrubbed from walls. But by then, it had crossed into Kish, and then further. It wasn't just a mark now. It was an idea that something could be remembered outside the archive. That clay didn't need to be sanctioned to speak. A tablet was found near the banks of a village south of Lagash. On it, the bent river symbol had been pressed above a list of names. No numbers, no debts, just names, dozens of them, carved slowly, unevenly, but with care. It was unclear what tied them together. No header, no date. But the last name on the tablet was Etu. When the high scribes of heard of this, they responded with what they had mastered, a flood of words. A new edict was issued across the southern lands. All records must bear a temple seal. Any tablet without it would be declared void of truth. Markets were warned. Villages were visited. Clay kilns were checked for unauthorized markings. But something had changed. This time, not everyone obeyed. Some farmers began keeping their own ledgers. Mothers wrote songs in wet clay and hung them near their doors. In smaller towns, people began making daily records, not for trade, but for weather, for the moon's rise, for which child first spoke a word. They did not follow the strict structure of Nippur's archivists. They didn't care to. What they wrote was not for empire, it was for each other. In Eridu, where the spiral had once ruled and then faded, the river's edge was now lined with simple tablets strung on twine, hanging like wind chimes. No temple watched them, no seal bound them. They swayed in silence, crumbling slowly, but seen. Writing had returned to the people, not stolen, but reclaimed. The cities would continue. The empires would still rise, fall, record, and rewrite. But somewhere between the monuments and the fields, between the inked names of kings and the fading marks of forgotten children, a new tradition had settled in. A word no longer needed permission to live. And when the river rose again, later, slower, as if remembering, it bent slightly at the place where the village once scratched names into earth. It did not break its banks. It merely moved around them. So what else has been written outside the archives? And if clay can hold both command and memory, who gets to decide which version becomes truth? The river bent, and the clay remembered. But even as villagers across southern Mesopotamia wrote their names without permission, and old symbols re-emerged beneath the shadow of vanished temples, a different kind of reckoning was taking shape in the north. One not carved into bricks or whispered through reed huts, but measured in shadows. In the royal city of Sippar, where the ziggurat touched the orange-pink haze of the evening sun and the archives spilled with seal-marked order, a question had begun to trouble the highest minds. Why does the world move as it does? Not just when the moon vanishes or when floods arrive, but when? What moment brings the tide? Which hour awakens the wind? It was a question only someone powerful enough to stop a field harvest for the sake of an idea could afford to ask. That someone was Amarsin, the newly crowned ruler of Sippar, heir to a throne carved by administrators and soldiers alike. Unlike the kings of who measured their worth in land, or the scribes of Nippur, who buried truth beneath seals, Amarsin had grown obsessed with something that neither war nor clay could fully explain: time itself. He was not the first to notice that the sun rose slower in winter, nor that shadows stretched longer when certain stars blinked above the horizon. But he was the first to believe those rhythms could be understood, named, and broken into smaller pieces, pieces that would obey him, the way cities and laws already did. In his second year of rule, Amarsin gathered a group of priests, scribes, and astronomers atop the ziggurat. He ordered a single stone column placed at the center of the open roof, its surface polished, its base embedded in a circle of crushed obsidian dust. Every day, for weeks, a scribe stood beside it and watched the shadow move. He recorded its reach, how far it pointed across the circle, how fast it slid during morning heat, how still it seemed just before dusk. Each mark was noted on a separate clay tablet. Within 3 months, there were over 200 tablets cataloguing the behavior of a single shadow. And yet, the sky remained unmoved. No barley grew because of these efforts. No canal was cleared. But Amarsin insisted. He told his court, "If we cannot rule the sun, we cannot rule our days." His words unsettled even the priests, who had long understood that time belonged to the gods. To measure, it was one thing. To command it, something else entirely. Still, no one disobeyed. Soon, Amarsin announced a new project, the division of light, a grand endeavor to break the day into fixed parts, not based on tasks or rituals, but on light itself. He believed that each portion of shadow could become a unit, a pulse of order, binding all movement under one structure. To accomplish this, he summoned artisans to create a massive bronze disc, embedded with markings and small indentations, placed flat upon the temple courtyard. A tall spike stood at its center. Each mark was calculated according to the shadows recorded on the previous tablets. It was an instrument unlike anything built before, a sundial, though that word did not yet exist. The court marveled, not at its function, most did not understand it, but at its beauty. Gold accents reflected the sun's blaze. The metal hummed with heat, and when Amarsin stood beside it, arms folded behind his back, he felt as though the very sky had begun to answer him. From that day, a new rule was enacted in Sipar. All tasks would begin and end according to the dial. Grain would be weighed when the shadow crossed the 5th mark. The city gate would open at the 2nd tilt. Offerings would burn as the bronze warmed. And slowly, life bent toward the instrument. At first, the people complied out of curiosity. Then, out of expectation. Then, habit. Time no longer belonged to roosters or river tides. It belonged to Amarsin's shadow. But in the southern fields, farmers began to notice something strange. The barley did not ripen by the king's divisions. The sun still warmed when it pleased, and rains came as they always had. Late, early, without apology. To sow only when the bronze dial gave permission was to risk starvation. One older farmer, named Shalatu, ignored the king's time entirely. He planted as his grandfather had, by the wind, by the bird migrations, by the feel of the soil's breath before dawn. His field, alone among his neighbors, yielded a full crop. His neighbors had waited too long, fearful of beginning before the 7th mark of morning had passed. When questioned, Shalatu merely said, "The grain doesn't know the king's hour." The words were repeated, then recorded, then frowned upon. Within a week, a royal scribe was sent to retrieve Shalatu's records. None existed. He didn't keep tablets. His time lived in muscle, in walking barefoot across the furrows, in noticing how worms rose when the soil was too wet. The scribe returned empty-handed. This quiet defiance unsettled Amarsin. He feared not rebellion, but irrelevance. He issued a new decree. Every field within the city's reach must submit a seasonal planting tablet, stamped with the official sundial mark. Those who refused would be denied access to the southern canal. The city's scribes obeyed. The priests adapted. But in the outer villages, those once inspired by Etu's silent lessons, people began carving their own markers again, not bronze, but stone or wood, not polished, but personal. They marked time by the bloom of reeds, the shape of clouds, the temperature of water before sunrise. To those in the palace, this seemed primitive. To those in the soil, it was survival. Yet Amarsin pressed forward. He commissioned a 2nd dial, larger, more ornate. This one to mark the moon's shadow, tracking the night. It took 3 seasons to construct, and by its completion, several canal walls had collapsed for lack of maintenance. Still, the king stood beneath the stars and watched the bronze grow cold in the dark, convinced that if light could be divided, so too could dreams. But one night, the moon did not appear. Clouds choked the sky. The dial remained dark. No shadow moved. No mark registered. Amar-Sin stood in silence, waiting for time to resume. He waited until morning. The next day, the workers returned to their duties, not at the dial's command, but by instinct. The markets opened at hunger. The canals were cleaned when they stank, and for a brief moment, time belonged again to the living. The king, bruised but not broken, stepped away from the dial. He did not remove it, but he stopped adding marks. It remained there, part monument, part memory. And over time, the people forgot its purpose. Children played in its shadow. Merchants used its flat surface to count copper pieces. Birds perched on its spike. But beneath its fading bronze, the question remained: if time can be divided, can it also be reclaimed? And who will mark the hours when kings no longer rise? Long after the sundial lost its voice, after the shadow lines faded beneath scuffed bronze, and the children no longer remembered why the spike stood at the center, a quiet uncertainty began to spread across Sippar. Time, which Amar-Sin had once tried to bind into measured segments, was slowly reclaiming its original form, wild, intuitive, and stubborn. The market opened when footsteps arrived. The canal gates rose when the heat became unbearable, and the fields listened only to the smell of the wind and the silence of birds. No tablet was needed to know when it was time to act. Amar-Sin still ruled, but something within him had dimmed, not in strength, but in confidence. He still issued decrees and spoke of stars and shadows, yet his words fell softer, as if unsure whether they would land. In the deepest chamber of his private archive, he continued to chart the movements of celestial bodies. He no longer spoke of controlling time, but now of understanding it. It was a subtle change, but not a meaningless one. Among the city's youth, however, a new fascination had taken hold. Not with the sky, but with the earth. Not with what moved above, but with what had already been recorded below. The archival rooms of Sippar, once visited only by appointed scribes, had become a place of curiosity for students, traders, and even potters. People came not just to resolve disputes, but to read, to search, to find names that matched their ancestry, to seek out the laws that first weighed fish or defined fair distance between wells. The tablets were no longer tools of power. They had become relics of memory. And yet, the farther one read into the shelves, the more contradictions appeared. One clay record claimed a village had been relocated during a drought. Another tablet, dated only a few seasons later, described the same village thriving without interruption. A third asserted that the flood of the 8th year had destroyed all barley crops, but nearby was a tablet listing barley exports that same season, signed by temple officials. To most, these contradictions were shrugged away, errors of copying, or tricks of interpretation. But to one woman, they felt deliberate. Her name was Ninsatu, daughter of a canal repairer and one of the few women permitted to study the archive ledgers directly. Her talent had been recognized early, not only for her memory, but for her refusal to look away when records clashed. She noticed not only what was written, but what was missing. Names that suddenly stopped appearing. Villages whose debts were recorded without ever listing what they owed. Harvests measured with precise numbers, but no corresponding labor entries. She began compiling these fragments into her own clay stack. Small, pale tiles she kept hidden under her robe and took home each night. She never invented anything. She only rearranged what was already there, layering inconsistencies side by side, building a picture not of lies, but of neglect. A city forgetting itself while pretending to remember. One evening, As the city prepared for a ceremony honoring the king's 15th year of light, Ninsatu placed a single tablet at the base of the old sundial. It bore no accusation, no names, no law. Only 4 lines of cuneiform pressed neatly into its surface. The hour obeyed only once, and the river ignored it. The grain ripened on its own, while the dial waited. The lines weren't intended to spark rebellion. They were meant to be read by the wind. But a potter's apprentice found it first and whispered it to a merchant, who recited it to a priest's servant, who told it to a gate guard, who, without understanding why, scratched it into the dust beneath his post. By morning, the lines had travelled farther than any law Amasin had passed that year. No one admitted to writing it, and no one dared destroy it. The temple council met in secret. Some urged that the dial be removed to preserve order. Others argued it should be restored, reclaimed as a tool of ritual, even if it no longer functioned as intended. Amasin, weary, told them to do nothing. "Let the sun wear it down," he said. "It will forget us before we forget it." But it did not forget. The bronze spike, though dulled and bent from years of play and weather, remained. And each time the sun passed overhead, it cast a shadow across the faint, worn lines, once carved with ambition. Travellers began to treat the dial as a site of memory, not invention. Some left offerings, others left poems. A few pressed soft clay with their own hours, marking the moment they had stood there, not to measure, but to witness. Meanwhile, beyond the city walls, in the villages where Etu's voice had never fully disappeared, a new kind of tablet began to appear. Narrow, unsealed, with short lines describing events in personal terms. "The rain was late, so we waited 2 more nights." Or, "My mother sang before the river turned black." These were not historical records. They were fragments of presence. Clay as conversation, not control. Ninsatu continued her quiet gathering, never challenging the temple outright, but instead training a small group of students to question how truth was framed. She taught them that every tablet was a mirror, and that mirrors could be angled. She called her collection "The Hours That Were Not Asked For." Years later, after Amasin's death, Sipar's new ruler, a boy crowned too young and advised by men too old, ordered the temple archives reorganized. Shelves were consolidated, dusty tablets buried deeper. But Ninsatu's records escaped notice, not because they were hidden, but because no one believed the plain, narrow tiles carried weight. And perhaps that was their greatest power. In time, the city no longer told stories of the hour that divided the day. Children no longer bowed at the bronze disc. The priesthood turned their gaze back to the stars, and the common people looked forward, not upward, with their feet in soil and their eyes on clouds. But somewhere in a quiet room, lined with unpolished clay, a single line remained etched above the doorway. "The sun cannot read." So what happens when the hands that once wrote for kings now write for no one at all? And if time can be felt but not measured, what else have we mistaken for certainty? After the lines were scrubbed from the sundial's surface and its bronze edges dulled beyond repair, Amasin's dream of dividing the day had passed into memory, half respected, half pitied. The shadow he once tried to command now stretched freely across Sipar, no longer bound by wedges or rituals. But what he left behind, though faded, did not vanish. His failure had not been in ambition alone, but in assuming that time could be controlled without listening to the world it passed through. Long after his death, his dial remained at the center of the city, not as an instrument, but as an ornament. The merchants used it to shade their stalls in the noon heat. Children traced their fingers around its weathered rim while waiting for their mothers to finish counting lentils. Its original purpose was forgotten, yet its presence was never questioned. It was simply always there, like the dry wind that followed the afternoon, or the creaking wooden beams of the temple roof. Time had moved on, and yet strangely, it hadn't. In a quieter corner of Sippar, Ninsatu's clay collection grew. Hidden not in secrecy, but in disregard, the tablets she and her students had compiled over the years formed an alternate archive, one filled with rhythms that did not match official records. These weren't records of kings, or battles, or floods. They were simple remembrances. The day someone's daughter spoke her first word beneath a fig tree, the night a stray dog howled just before the fish disappeared from the canal, the morning a widow counted the time it took her bread to rise by how long it took a bee to return. To the temple scribes, these were trivialities, but to the people who carved them, they were anchors, proof that they had lived, not just according to law, but according to their own seasons. One day, a traveling envoy from distant Akkad arrived in Sippar, sent to examine the temples, evaluate grain inventories, and assess regional loyalty. He was young, precise in speech, his robes sharp with starch. He asked to see the famous archive, the one that measured the hours, he said, with an expectant smile. The priests brought him to the old sundial, now surrounded by laughter and food stalls. His expression collapsed. "Where is the time?" he asked. They could not answer. He asked next to see the tablets that recorded Amarsin's reign. They showed him a hall lined with shelves, many of them warped, the tablets cracked from years of drought. The records still spoke of time divisions, temple rituals, celestial alignments, but they had not been copied or read in decades. The envoy, frustrated, scolded the scribes. What use is a history that no longer remembers how to count? But as he prepared to leave, one of Ninsatu's students intercepted him with a single thin tablet, simple, unsealed, and nearly crude in shape. It bore a short inscription: "We harvested early. The sun was late, but the worms didn't wait." The envoy frowned. "What is this supposed to mean?" The student only bowed. It meant everything to the people who ate that winter. He left in silence. Word spread after that visit. Some claimed the envoy had reported Sippar as disordered. Others whispered that he had sent a message to Akkad recommending the city be left to its own decay. But no punishment came, no war followed, and Sippar, once again, was left to chart its own course, not in rebellion, but in rhythm. In the years that followed, the city's priorities quietly shifted. Less grain was tithed to the temples. More was stored in communal bins. The bronze sundial, eventually cracked by a lightning strike, was not replaced. Instead, the pieces were melted and reforged into tools. A ceremonial hammer, a canal gate hinge, the frame for a new bread oven near the eastern gate. No one mourned it. No one rebuilt it. Yet its shadow lived on in other ways. A new kind of tablet began to circulate. Short, wide, with space for both number and story. Farmers marked the moment a calf was born beside the count of how many grew sick that season. Bakers recorded not just how many loaves they sold, but how many returned uneaten and why. Time, once chopped into stiff slices by a king's desire, had softened into narrative again. And in doing so, it became useful. One such tablet, found near a kiln buried in a later mud brick structure, bore a line written by a woman whose name was pressed only once in the corner. "I write this so my daughter will know how the morning felt when the river forgot to rise." No one knows who she was. No law bore her seal. But her moment was preserved, not for judgment, but for connection. That, perhaps, was what Amarsin had never understood. He wanted to divide time into obedience, but the people needed to feel it. They needed to know how long a song lasted beside the canal, how slowly grief moved across a month, how quickly a season could pass when laughter returned to the home. And so, Sippar did not abandon time. It simply rewrote its relationship to it. In the outskirts, near the old irrigation line that once separated field from field, according to sundial marks, a child named Baraku asked his grandmother why the sun had no lines on it anymore. She smiled and replied, "It never did. The lines were ours." Baraku would one day learn to press symbols into clay, but instead of copying temple charts, he would write his sister's name beside the date she learned to swim. He would mark the day his uncle died, not by the number of hours he'd lived, but by the exact scent of the earth that morning. His tablets were not kept in a vault, they were stored in the kitchen. Years later, as Sippar began to fade, its trade routes shrinking, its temples less full, its ziggurat crumbling from rain, no one came to claim its archives. The tablets remained scattered across homes, courtyards, and buried corners of bread ovens. Some dissolved with floodwater. Some were shattered in earthquakes. But a few, just a few, survived, only to be uncovered, thousands of years later, baffling modern scholars with their mixture of numbers and soft human sentences, and among them, a broken tablet fragment bearing a single line. The day the king measured time, the river kept flowing anyway. So, what else have we tried to measure, only to find it slipping through our hands? And who, long after our tablets have crumbled, will remember not what we counted, but what we noticed? As Sippar's bronze cracked under rain and its ziggurat faded into quiet ruins, trade routes shifted like reeds in wind. Rivers once worshipped for their constancy had begun to change course, carving through unfamiliar plains, refusing to remain where maps had placed them. The cities that had once dictated time and law were now whispering rather than commanding. But the people, scattered along dry canals and forgotten roads, were learning something older than stone. That survival did not come from dominion, but from exchange. In the northern plain, where the wind scoured the earth bare and rain came only in sudden, violent bursts, a small settlement had formed along a natural spring. The villagers there were few in number, descendants of traders, fishermen and scribes, whose paths had ended in this arid place. They had little grain, no brick temple, and no king. But they had one thing the others did not: salt. Not mined, nor harvested by hand from distant seabeds. This salt emerged from the earth itself, collecting in white crusts at the edge of shallow pools where the spring water evaporated under the relentless sun. It clung to the ground like frost that refused to melt. No one prayed to it. No one claimed to understand it. But they gathered it, gently, in woven baskets, and soon learned its value went far beyond the edge of their fields. The first traders arrived without intention. A wandering herder, seeking a shortcut back to his village, paused to let his goats drink from the brackish spring. He tasted the water, spat it out, and noticed the fine powder that had caked his sandals. He scraped it up, rubbed it between his fingers, and later used it to preserve a cut of meat meant for his long journey home. To his surprise, the meat did not sour. When he returned weeks later and offered the villagers a jar of fermented fish paste in exchange for more of the white dust, a trade was born. No one in the village set prices. No tablets were pressed to define the rules. But word travelled quickly through the merchants who moved like wind across the old southern roads. There is a place, they said, where the earth gives you salt, and the people ask nothing but fair measure. Soon, traders from cities larger and richer began arriving, not with gold or lapis, but with goods that mattered to the villagers. Cloth for the sun, oil for their lamps, cured dates, reeds for roof mending, even stories in return for salt. One traveller brought a carved box containing a broken reed stylus he claimed belonged to a forgotten king. Another carried a tablet fragment that bore only a name, etched. But the villagers did not trade for names. They traded for what kept them alive. Within a few seasons, the salt pools were surrounded by low market stalls, reed mats staked into the dust, shade cloths held up by bones of date palms. No walls were built, no temple rose. There was no shrine, no seal. But every seventh day, without summons or decree, the market bloomed like a desert flower, just for one thing: salt. It was not bartered like grain or haggled over like cattle. It was measured by taste, by weight in the hand, by the sheen of the crust. It preserved food, yes, but also memory. Traders began marking their routes by the market's position. They spoke of before salt and after salt in their stories. Time bent again, not by a king's sundial, but by a flavor. A woman named Darina emerged quietly from the villagers. She did not lead, but she organized. She marked where the wind blew strongest and shifted the mats accordingly. She noticed which pools gave the finest salt and taught others how to avoid the spring's bitter edges. Her hands, perpetually coated with salt dust, became a kind of clock, each movement done in rhythm with the drying sun. She never wrote a single tablet, but her memory held the balance of the market like a scale no scribe could draft. Traders began trusting her more than their own ledgers. "Ask Darina," they would say, when uncertain about an exchange. "She remembers the taste." One day, a priest from a distant temple arrived, his robes frayed, his sandals worn thin. He claimed he had walked for 6 days without food, guided only by rumors. In his hand, he carried a sealed tablet wrapped in linen. He asked for a basket of salt, not to eat, but to bless. When Darina handed him a pinch, he knelt beside the spring and poured it into the wind, chanting a name no one recognized. Then, he opened the tablet and read aloud a list of laws, each concerning trade, weight, and fairness. When he finished, he looked up and said, "This market fulfills them all." No one responded. They hadn't known there were laws. The priest left before sunrise, and still the salt came. But something had shifted. Traders now left behind small offerings, not coins, but memories. A necklace of clay beads from a lost daughter, a bowl carved with a name not spoken in generations, a scrap of cloth dyed the same color as a childhood home. Darina placed them on a single mat near the spring, not to display, just to keep. That was how the market became more than a place of exchange. It became a place of return. Children born near the salt pools grew up learning how to taste differences, invisible to others. Salt meant for meat. Salt meant for milk. Salt that cured quickly. Salt that lasted. They learned not from books, but from stories spoken while stirring pots. One boy, tasked with carrying salt to a neighboring village, returned with a clay fragment bearing a spiral. He asked what it meant. Darina held the piece, brushed it clean and whispered, "It was once a promise, I think. Or maybe a mistake." She placed it beside the bowl. And so the market remained, not ruled, not measured, not named on any map, but visited, loved, and remembered. Even when the rains failed and other settlements shrank into dust, the salt pools glistened under the sun's cruel light. The people adjusted. They gathered smaller crusts, stored it with care, taught patience to the impatient. They needed no king to tell them how the day should be shaped. The salt did that for them. So what other tastes have guided us more than laws? And how many histories were preserved, not by scribes or cities, but by hands covered in dust that never asked to be remembered? The salt clung to everything. It coated the souls of travelers, settled in the seams of folded cloth, crusted into the corners of copper scales. Even the animals that passed through the market bore its scent. It did not rot. It did not spoil. It waited. quiet, enduring, familiar. Unlike the tablets that cracked in damp, or the temple walls that crumbled with each rain, the salt remembered, without needing permission or protection. Darina had grown older by now, her hands still strong, her back a little bent. She no longer walked the full circle of the spring each morning. Instead, she stood beneath the leaning pole where the offerings were placed and nodded to those who knew what to do. She spoke less, and when she did, people leaned in, as if her words were part of something longer than they could hear. The market had changed since the first quiet exchanges. It had grown, not in buildings or banners, but in rhythm. Traders now came not only from the southern cities, but from places with no name, carried by memory and need. Some stayed a day, others for seasons. A few left nothing behind but a handprint in the salt near the water's edge. And yet, amid this growing current of movement, the market kept its center. No coin dictated value. No priest watched the scale. The measure was taste, weight, and trust. If a stranger tried to cheat, they were not punished. They were simply not served. Word of mouth in this place was heavier than any king's seal. One late season, a group of men arrived from the far eastern hills, cloaked in thick wool, faces marked with fatigue. They brought rare black stone in exchange for salt, but more than that, they brought news. A new empire was expanding across the river valleys, building roads, recording boundaries with sharpened reeds, carving names of rulers into mountaintops. Cities were being absorbed, not by conquest, but by paperwork. Farmers now paid in coin. Bakers were told what to bake, and all things were weighed against a new law, uniformity. They warned that the salt market would not go unnoticed forever. Darina listened. She said nothing. That evening, she sat by the edge of the spring and dragged her fingers through the shallow water, watching the surface ripple but never break. When one of her students asked whether they should prepare for the empire's arrival, she replied, "You can't prepare for something that doesn't understand where it's standing." Still, she made a change. For the first time in the market's long, unwritten history, she agreed to write something down. Not a list, not a law, a memory. She pressed a single tablet, not square, but round, like the salt crust itself, using a soft reed and a quiet hand. On it, she wrote only what she had seen with her own eyes. The first trader, who had exchanged fish paste for a handful of dust. The cloth from that never faded in the sun. The day the spring overflowed without warning. The time a child laughed so loudly that birds scattered from the rafters. There were no numbers, no names, only presence. She placed it beneath the bowl of offerings, and then she pressed no more. The following season, a delegation from the growing empire arrived. Not soldiers, but officials, polite, polished, and endlessly curious. They asked questions: who ran the market? Who set the prices? Who recorded the trades? Who collected the tribute? The villagers answered with shrugs. The traders gave half smiles. The children laughed and pointed at the spring. Frustrated, the officials requested to speak with the one in charge. Darina came forward, standing beneath the shade of the pole as she always had. They bowed stiffly. She did not bow back. They explained that under new law, all trade centers must be recognized, taxed, and administered. Uniform tablets must be issued. Seals must be applied. A weight standard must be enforced. And from now on, all salt was to be marked as a state commodity. She listened, silent. When they finished, she bent down, picked up a palmful of salt, and offered it to them. "Is this what you came for?" she asked. One of the officials took it, held it in his palm. It was coarse, irregular, no seal, no stamp, just salt. He tasted it, and for a brief moment, he forgot the rules. Then he remembered. He apologized. "We must return with documentation," he said. Someone will come to formalize the records. Darina nodded once, then turned away. They never returned. Whether out of respect, fear, or confusion, no one knows. But the market continued, unmarked. Years passed. The road widened. The world changed. The empire drew maps that showed the region, but always skipped the spring. Their surveyors were thorough, except there, as if their rulers had agreed to look the other way. Darina died on a day when the sky held no clouds. The traders did not wail or build a monument. Instead, they carried her body to the edge of the spring and covered it with reed mats soaked in salt. They sang no songs. But that year, more salt was traded than ever before. Her round tablet remained beneath the offering bowl. Over time, the words faded, but not the shape. Travelers who passed through would hold it in their hands, turn it, and sometimes press their own marks onto new clay circles before moving on. The empire, though vast, eventually fell. The cities they built crumbled. Their uniform tablets broke. Their names vanished into cracked stone. But the salt pools endured, just as quiet, just as steady. And once, many generations later, a wandering historian from a distant land arrived at the site. He found no walls, no columns, no temple, but he tasted the air and knew he was standing somewhere ancient. Beneath his feet, he uncovered a small jar. Inside it, 6 round clay tablets, unsealed, soft with age, marked not with commands, but with observations. He read only one before night fell. It said, "She didn't lead. She remembered." So what survives when rulers are forgotten and cities erased? And can a market that asked for nothing ever truly disappear? There are places history forgets to write down, not because they were unimportant, but because they refused to speak in the language of conquest. The salt market by the spring was one of them. It did not burn like a city under siege, nor fall like a temple struck by lightning. It did not rise in rebellion, or announce itself in tablets bearing royal seals. And so, while empires around it collapsed into stone and silence, the salt endured, grain by grain, wordlessly. Long after Darina's death, her memory became less of a figure and more of a rhythm. The traders no longer said her name out loud. They said things as she might have said them. Not too much, when the salt weighed heavy. Taste first, when a stranger arrived. It's not about the count, when disputes emerged. Her presence shifted from person to pulse, guiding but invisible. The round tablets she once inspired continued to appear, each one unique. Some had only lines, curved or straight. Others bore phrases in dialects, no longer spoken anywhere else. A few had small indentations, made by children's thumbs. These weren't kept in an archive. They were traded freely, left near the spring, or tied to bundles of salt wrapped in cloth. People gave them away without explanation. If you understood the tablet, it was yours to keep. If not, you returned it to the earth. This quiet exchange became known simply as the measure. It wasn't a standard of weight or length. It couldn't be enforced. But everyone who came to the salt market knew it existed. It was the line between fair and greedy, between memory and performance. Some tried to replicate it in other places, new markets, in growing towns, along younger rivers. But something never carried over. The salt didn't taste the same. The rhythm didn't hold. Then came a drought that tested everything. The spring, which had always ebbed and flowed with the seasons, began to wither. The pools shrank. Cracks formed in the ground. Salt no longer gathered in crusts, but hardened into uneven slabs that resisted harvest. The traders still came, but they left with less, and those who arrived for the first time hoping to profit from the scarcity, grew impatient. One man, dressed in the fine robes of a city far to the west, offered a sealed tablet in exchange for a full basket. His clay bore the symbol of a surviving bureaucracy, tight, wedge-heavy, carved for authority. "This tablet guarantees trade under the Temple of Light," he said. "Your market is recognized now." The villagers read the symbols but said nothing. Instead of answering, an elder named Shabal, who had once been a boy watching Darina from behind reed mats, walked to the edge of the spring. He scooped what little salt remained, examined it, then poured half of it back. "If the earth forgets to give," he said, "we must remember to take less." The trader protested. "That is not enough for what I offer." Shabal nodded. "Then you offer too much." He returned to his mat, leaving the sealed tablet untouched. That evening, no one mentioned the incident. The market continued as usual, though quieter, more watchful. The drought would last another 2 years. Several families moved on, seeking more generous springs elsewhere, but those who remained adapted. They gathered earlier in the morning, before the heat rose. They built shades that conserved moisture. They learned to read the wind like a sentence half spoken, and slowly the salt returned, not in abundance, but in patience. Years passed. The empire that had once sent the trader collapsed into civil unrest. Its cities fell prey to internal weight. No one came bearing tablets anymore. No one asked to formalize the trade. The spring had no guards, but it didn't need them. And yet, something curious began to happen. Travelers started arriving not to trade, but to observe. Historians, mapmakers, poets. They came from distant coasts and highland valleys, drawn by vague rumors of a place where salt moved without currency, and time was tracked in taste. They asked many questions, scribbled many notes, but they rarely understood the answers. One poet named Tarak spent 6 months near the spring, recording everything he could see: conversations, measurements, gestures. He made dozens of sketches, pressing ink onto parchment with reverence. On his final day, he approached Shabal, now hunched and white-haired, and asked him, "What do you call this system?" Shabal looked at the salt gathered that morning, still moist, glowing under the low sun. "We don't," he said. "But how do you know when it's right?" Shabal placed his hand flat on the ground. "When it leaves nothing behind but what was needed." Tarak left, confused. His writings became popular in distant courts, where scholars debated whether the market was a remnant of an older civilization or the seed of a new one. Some called it a communal anomaly. Others believed it to be a myth entirely. But the people at the spring never read these arguments. They didn't need to. One final story drifted from the salt pools before they disappeared. From memory. A young girl named Nia, curious and quiet, had begun gathering the old round tablets others ignored. She didn't collect them for trade or display. She simply liked their shapes. She stacked them in her sleeping mat, carried them to the spring, whispered into their cracks. One day, as her grandmother told her the story of how Darina had once measured the air by listening to the silence between footsteps, Nia pressed her thumb into a fresh slab of clay. She made no symbols, just a single indentation. Then she left it on a mat near the water. Others saw it. They didn't ask why. The next week, 3 more tablets appeared, each bearing the same soft thumbprint. No name, no seal, no meaning except someone was here and understood. And so, long after cities lost their gods, and the reeds forgot the names carved into old palace walls, a market that sold only salt taught its final lesson: that the most enduring measures are not those written in clay, but those left behind in what we choose not to take. So what else have we tried to own, only to realize it never needed a ledger? And if salt could hold a civilization together without a single law, what might we still remember if we stopped writing and started tasting? Long before laws were codified in stone and empires carved their victories into mountain faces, a gentler transformation took root. One not enforced by armies or dictated by scribes. It did not come in the form of conquest, nor as a decree from the heavens. It came in a clay jar, warm and heavy, passed from hand to hand beneath the flickering oil lamps of a modest village near the southern bend of the Euphrates. And it came from a woman named Ninkasi. She was not born to wealth, nor to temples. Her hands were stained not with ink, but with mash, the thick mixture of soaked grains and crushed dates. She stirred daily with a carved wooden paddle. Her family had been brewers for 3 generations, each passing down not a written recipe, but a rhythm, a memory of heat and waiting, of watching bubbles rise, of listening to the yeast speak before it could be seen. Beer, in their home, was not just a drink, it was an offering, a medicine, a way to remember the seasons when words had not yet arrived. Ninkasi, however, did not follow the rhythm blindly. From an early age, she questioned why barley behaved differently in shaded corners, why the sun made the foam rise faster, why some batches settled into sweetness, while others turned bitter without warning. She kept no tablets. She kept her ears open. The village where she lived had little to offer the outside world. It lay between larger settlements, bypassed by merchants who preferred cities with scales and walls. But once a year, the temple priests from Uruk sent agents to collect offerings: grain, cloth, oil, and beer. Always beer. They arrived with authority, but little patience, demanding volume over quality. The villagers complied. The priests left, and nothing changed. Until one season, the beer turned sour. No one knew why. The barley had been clean, the dates ripe, but batch after batch curdled before the jars could be sealed. The villagers panicked. Without their offering, they would face temple penalties, perhaps a withdrawal of irrigation rights, or access to the scribes who documented land claims. Ninkasi refused to guess. She took a clay shard and traced patterns from the year's weather. She marked when the river had first risen, when the reeds bloomed early, when the air grew unusually hot at night. And then she sat with her jars and listened. It wasn't the barley, it was the storage. The jars had been moved closer to the market lane, where hoofbeats shook the ground, and the sun struck the wall for an hour longer each day. It was a simple shift, a forgotten decision, but it had changed the brew. She corrected it, covered the jars with wet cloth, moved them into deeper shade, waited. The beer returned. That year, when the temple agents arrived, they expected what they always did: rough, flat beer that would be offered to the gods but likely discarded after the rituals. They opened the first jar lazily, tasted it, and fell silent. It was different, fuller, rounder. The flavor held the breath of dates without drowning the grain. It was alive. One agent insisted on bringing an extra jar back to the temple, not for offering but for study. A month later, Ninkasi was summoned, not arrested, not threatened, invited. She arrived at the temple of Uruk barefoot, carrying nothing but her brewing paddle wrapped in linen. The priests, lined in rows beneath gold and incense, expected a woman trembling from dust and obscurity. Instead, they received someone who walked slowly, eyes forward, heart steady. She bowed only once. They asked her how she had achieved the flavor. She told them it wasn't the barley. It wasn't the dates. It was where the jars had waited. One priest scoffed. "You're saying the sun makes prayers taste better?" She answered without hesitation. "I'm saying the gods might prefer what we don't rush." Though it was not the reply they expected, none could argue. The jars she brought were placed in the inner sanctum, For the first time, beer made outside temple grounds was included in the ceremony. It was poured not only as libation, but tasted by the priests themselves, something they had rarely done. Ninkasi was offered a place among the temple staff. She declined. "You already have scribes," she said. "I'm listening for something else." Instead, she proposed something no brewer had ever dared before: to teach the priests to brew it themselves, not to replace her, but to remember. Each morning for 12 days, she led a quiet procession into the temple courtyard. She brought no scrolls, no symbols, only grain, water, and time. She showed them how to crush the barley with the heel, not the stone. How to smell the difference between readiness and rot. How to stir until their arms ached because the yeast could feel hesitation. She made them wait beside the jars, sit in silence, taste with eyes closed. Some priests mocked it at first, others endured it out of duty, but by the end of the 12 days, they no longer laughed. They asked questions, not about ingredients, but about patience. The final lesson was simple. She placed a fresh jar in the sun for 1 hour, then moved it into shade. "This is the only rule," she said. "You may write it down, but the brew won't listen." They asked what to call the method. She said it had no name. She returned to her village with no titles, no rewards, and no offerings from the temple. But the following year, when the agents arrived, they brought no demands, only a question: has the shade shifted yet? And so, beer entered the temples, not just as ritual, but as remembrance. Priests began writing poems about its scent, its mood, its defiance. Scribes tried to measure its readiness in time, but each batch refused to obey the same rhythm twice. The brewers in the temple learned to trust silence again. Ninkasi brewed until her final days. She passed on no formal records, only jars left in corners with symbols scratched into their rims, circles, waves, lines indicating warmth, waiting, stillness. After she died, one of her clay tablets was found buried beneath the brewing platform. It read, "The grain already knows what to become. We only need to stop interrupting it." So what other truths have we tried to document before fully tasting them? And how much have we lost by speaking too soon? After Ninkasi returned to her village, the temple walls seemed quieter, not physically, but in posture. The priests, who had once stood rigid in their rituals, now stirred their own jars in the dark before sunrise, hands damp with mash, shoulders gently hunched, not from defeat, but from listening. The temple had not been humbled, it had been reminded. That divinity did not always come from elevation, but from observation. Her departure had left no formal void. She held no title, left no successor. Yet her absence felt large in the way rivers feel when their banks are left dry. Not because they vanish, but because something still echoes where the current used to be. Back in Uruk, the high priest Tabranu sat with a problem he hadn't anticipated. Each year, during the moon cycle's final night, the temple performed the offering of flame and ferment, a rite meant to appease the gods of fertility, water, and memory. For generations, it had been conducted in perfect precision. Oil lamps were lit in 7 arcs, incantations were read from tablets in rising cadence, and temple-brewed beer was poured as libation into carved trenches surrounding the altar. But now, the beer tasted different. It had been brewed precisely as the previous year. The ratios had been measured, the steps followed, the fermentation timed with shadow markings on the temple floor. Yet something was missing. The priests noticed first, then the servants. Even the attendants, who were forbidden to speak during the rites, exchanged brief, puzzled glances. It was not spoiled. It was correct. But it was silent. Tabranu once skeptical of Ninkasi, now found himself haunted by her final instruction. The brew won't listen to the reed. He summoned an elder acolyte named Imur-En, who had trained directly under Ninkasi during her 12 days in the courtyard. Imur-En no longer worked in the main chamber. He had quietly returned to managing the grain storage vaults, avoiding attention. When Tabranu asked him what had gone wrong, the scribe replied plainly, "You removed the weighting. You measured, but you didn't watch." Tabranu, who had memorized over 300 ritual formulas, fell silent. Imur-En suggested something that would have been heretical even a season ago, that the sacred beer for the offering should not be brewed inside the temple at all. "You mean to outsource it to the villagers?" Tabranu asked, almost offended. "No," Imur-En replied. "I mean to let the earth make it." That year, for the first time, the brew was not stored in the sacred chamber, but fermented in an open courtyard with no canopy. Clay jars were placed beneath the sky, among reeds and wind. The barley came from the western plain, the dates from a nearby orchard, the water from a canal freshly dredged the week before. It was watched, but not directed, protected, but not scheduled. When it foamed, it foamed. When it hissed, they listened, and it changed everything. The night of the ceremony, when the libation was poured, the scent that rose from the jar held something familiar, yet unnameable. It wasn't just taste, it was tone. The temple did not erupt in wonder. There was no miracle, but those who attended lingered longer. Fewer turned away during the prayer. The silences stretched wider. Some claimed they heard whispers in the space between the chants. It was later called the first warm offering, not for its temperature, but for its effect. In the years that followed, the practice took root. The brewing process became less about control and more about partnership. Scribes still documented the stages, but with humility rather than authority. They stopped calling the fermentation obedience and started referring to it as conversation. Some even began marking their jars not with words, but with shapes that reflected the weather during fermentation. Spirals for wind, slashes for dry days, wave lines for late morning rain. In the outer temples of smaller towns, this method was adopted eagerly. Priests began experimenting with ingredients, but not to innovate, for reverence. They added honey during warm nights, bark during cold spells, not to impress the gods, but to include the land. They did not ask for divine approval. They waited to see if the jars would bubble. The beer, in this new age, was no longer a fixed recipe. It became a sacred guess. Yet not all accepted the change. Some in the capital temples feared that loosening the rules would dissolve the hierarchy. They accused the brewers of superstition. They pointed out inconsistencies, 2 identical batches from the same ingredients that behaved differently. It undermines our precision, they argued. It undermines the divine. But none could explain why, in the years since Ninkasi's method had returned, more villagers came to the offerings, even without summons. Why the altar never overflowed with uncollected jars. Why the temple's name, once chanted by obligation, was now spoken in lullabies, by mothers who didn't read but still remembered the scent of waiting mash on a warm morning. One year, a young scribe named Lelam wrote a poem beside her brewing platform. I pressed no seal. I signed no name. Still, the gods drank, and so did the silence. She placed the tablet in the sun to dry, then left it beneath the altar. No one retrieved it, but many copied its lines. And when a new generation of brewers rose, they no longer asked, "What is the correct time?" They asked, "What has the air asked of us today?" The temples, though still stone, had shifted. Their memory had softened, not in strength, but in direction, like yeast expanding in silence. So what else might we reclaim, not by declaring, but by listening? And if a jar, left alone, could teach the priests to wait, What might we hear if we finally stopped trying to name every flavor? By the time the old altar stones had worn smooth from decades of touch, when the reed pens had grown hesitant to define what could not be standardized, and when even the temple walls began to echo more with silence than with command, the practice of brewing had become something sacred, but not in the way the priesthood had once envisioned. It was no longer about purity or measurement. It was about presence. The way the mash smelled at dawn, the sound of the first fermenting bubble rising through a still courtyard, the moment when the brew itself decided it was ready, no sooner, no later. And in that sacred slowness, something unexpected happened. Prayer changed, not in wording, nor in the shape of the hands, but in what it hoped for. Once, the supplications offered beside the jars had been grand. Petitions for abundant harvests, for floods to come on time, for the king to live long and reign justly. But now, the prayers whispered into the rising foam were smaller, gentler, more specific. A father asked that his daughter's cough soften by morning. A widow offered thanks for the bread she hadn't expected to bake. A boy pressed his forehead to the jar's edge and whispered, "Let her remember me." The jars, unsealed and left in shaded courtyards, absorbed it all. It was said, quietly, that the foam carried the prayers upward, that when it overflowed in silence, it meant the plea had been accepted. No scribe wrote this down, but more and more, no one asked them to. The temples, which had once operated with a rigid separation between the sacred and the mundane, now blurred that line. Bakers arrived early to knead dough beside fermenting vats. Daughters were taught to stir with one hand while holding a sleeping sibling with the other. No longer was the temple beer made only by trained hands in controlled quarters. It was made by the same people who drank it, who waited for it, who shared it with gods and neighbors alike. A new kind of tablet began to appear, smaller than those pressed for law and far softer. They were not meant to last. They were placed beside the brewing jars and left there only for a single night, then broken into pieces and scattered into the mash or burned at dawn. These were not records. They were offerings made of clay and air, poems, wishes, memories too heavy to speak aloud. Some bore only fingerprints. Others bore curved marks made by reeds dipped in beer instead of ink. One such tablet fragment, found buried centuries later near the southern edge of Uruk's oldest courtyard, bore 7 simple symbols. They translated roughly to, "Let the foam rise where her voice fell." It is not known who pressed them, but the jar that had stood beside it had cracked gently at the base and tipped toward the east. Scholars argue over whether this was intentional. Meanwhile, in the villages, Ninkassi's name returned, not as doctrine, but as story. Children were told that she had once asked the grain how it felt before it was ground, that she could taste wind in mash, that when she died, the yeast wept for 3 days. None of this was written, yet it lived. In one town, a jar was found sealed, not with clay, but with woven leaves. Inside was a tightly curled reed, soaked in old beer. When unwrapped, the reed unfurled slowly, like it had been waiting to speak. No text was inside, just the scent, and that scent told a story. As generations passed, new cities rose, shaped by different ambitions. Metal replaced clay. Scribes turned to ledgers, not prayers, but the legacy of Ninkassi's brew remained in corners, quiet, enduring. In every courtyard where a jar was left to breathe, in every pause before a stir, in every word whispered into foam, not for an answer, but simply to be heard. There is one final story. It was told near the edge of the river, not far from where the salt markets once traded in silence. A group of workers, digging a new irrigation line, uncovered a stone basin buried beneath centuries of silt. It was round, smooth, and at the bottom were faint marks, nearly erased. Not a law, not a name, just a shallow swirl like the path of a stirring paddle. The foreman, curious, brought in a local woman known for her brewing. She stood over the basin, touched the swirl, and simply said, "She was here." When asked who, the woman didn't answer. That night, the workers brewed beer in the same basin, using barley and water without instruction, without ritual. And though none of them could explain why, they each claimed it tasted familiar. The next morning, one of them found a soft clay tablet resting by the basin's rim. It bore only 3 words: "Let it listen." So what else have we tried to control, only to learn that it listened better when we didn't speak? And how many answers have floated past us in the foam, unclaimed, not because they were hidden, but because we never thought to taste? The foam had risen, prayers had been whispered into jars, and the temples, once echo chambers of formula and flame, had begun to open their doors to the pulse of the people. As beer was left to speak for itself, something else began to falter. Not in the fields or the courtyards, but in the quiet rooms of clay and code where history had long been sculpted, line by line, into tablets meant to last forever. The scribes, once keepers of the world's order, were beginning to lose track, not of ink or structure, but of themselves. This decline did not arrive with any one catastrophe. There was no fire, no foreign invasion, no royal decree that reduced the scribes of Nippur and Lagash and Uruk into shadows. What happened was slower, softer, a quiet undoing. The work continued, but meaning began to drift. It started with the tablets. For centuries, scribes had copied and recopied everything from tax ledgers to hymns. They wrote not only what they heard, but what they were told to hear. Their marks were precise, their strokes flawless. They memorized thousands of signs, variations, honorifics, and legal forms. To be a scribe was to carry the weight of a kingdom on the edge of a reed. But as generations passed, the repetition outpaced the relevance. They were writing more, understanding less. A boy named Enlil-Amr was born into this world of ink and silence. His father and grandfather had both served the temple archives of Isin, a modest city between the crumbling edges of former capitals. As a child, Enlil-Amr would sit for hours watching his elders carve the same contracts again and again. Slaves sold, fields measured, debts transferred. It was beautiful, but hollow. By the time he was 12, he could mimic most of the symbols without knowing what they meant. By 15, he could recite a land division formula in his sleep, but not tell you who the land belonged to. No one asked him to understand, only to preserve. One evening, after a long day of copying tablets for a land dispute that neither party remembered initiating, Enlil-Amr found a fragment at the edge of the archive room. It was different. The lines were not straight. The signs were curved, almost unsure, and near the bottom, instead of a name or seal, was a small indentation, a thumbprint. Not formal, not placed with ceremony, just pressed there, once, gently. He asked the elder scribe who it belonged to. The elder frowned. Irrelevant. It's an unfinished record, likely discarded. But why the thumbprint? Enlil-Amr asked. The elder shrugged. Probably someone who didn't know what else to write. That night, Enlil-Amr couldn't sleep. The next day, he began to write his own tablet. Not one assigned, not one all instructed. It was short, only 5 lines. It read, "I saw a shadow rise beside the lamp. It wasn't mine. I followed it anyway. He did not sign it. He left it near the basin where scribes washed their hands before entering the archive chamber. By morning, the tablet was gone. He never saw it again. But a week later, he found another, just a single line. I copied my name today and forgot if it was true. No one claimed authorship, but slowly, more of these appeared. Small clay slips left in corners, tucked behind archive racks, hidden beneath broken styluses. They were not records, they were reflections, pieces of the scribes that had no place in the official ledgers, and none bore names. At first, the senior priests ignored it. Then, they became suspicious. Not of heresy, but of deviation. Anything outside the system threatened the illusion of permanence. One master scribe was overheard saying, if they begin to write what they feel, how long before they forget what they're told? But the forgetting had already begun. In Ur, two separate archives held conflicting versions of the same law. One scribe claimed it required 3 witnesses to validate a debt. Another showed 5. Neither could explain the discrepancy. In Nippur, a festival tablet misdated a key ceremony by nearly a month. Yet the temple still followed it, unaware. When a visiting dignitary asked to see the original, the priest stalled. The original was missing. And so, scribes began copying copies of copies. Each layer further from meaning. The ink held, but the intention dissolved. Enlil-Amah began gathering the unnamed tablets in secret. He stored them in an old oil jar beneath the far end of the archive room, hidden behind tax records so dull no one ever touched them. Each night, after his formal duties ended, he would read one at random. Some made no sense. Others made too much. One read, "The symbol for grain also means mouth. We feed what feeds us, then forget." He started writing responses, not in defiance, but in dialogue. Not to argue, but to answer. The clay began to speak back. It wasn't long before others joined him. A quiet network of scribes, scattered across the older cities, began leaving messages in common places. Well rims, food storage ledgers, cracks in foundation bricks. Always unsigned. Always ephemeral. Their marks weren't meant to last. They were meant to remind. A new kind of scribal knowledge emerged. Not taught in schools, but felt. These scribes began to notice where official language no longer described reality. They saw that the temple decrees didn't match what happened in the fields. That prayers copied from 5 generations ago no longer fit the voices of those who offered them. They began to call themselves Ashumu, not scribes, but listeners. Eventually the priesthood noticed. Several were summoned. No punishments were declared, just a warning. If you continue to record what cannot be proved, you will not be remembered. But that was the point. The Ashumu were not trying to be remembered. They were trying to remember differently. Enlil-Amah disappeared from the archive 3 winters later. No formal record marked his death. His name faded from temple rolls. But beneath one stone bench in the northern court of Isin, archaeologists centuries later would find a rounded tablet with a curved line through its center. No words, no signature, but the line matched the one found beneath Nin Kassi's basin. So, what is forgotten when names are preserved, but voices are silenced? And how long can truth survive if no one remembers why it was written?